Okay, we're going to start this morning. Before we do, I want to let y'all know that I've become aware of several people, many different people that are listening to us online. And, and I would like to say one of my old friends, Dennis, sent me a letter. Now, Dennis, if you're listening, I wrote you a letter back, but I had lost the envelope, so I do not have an address. So please email the church. That's pvbc@pvbc1834.com, or send me another letter so I can write you back. I have a letter written. So we do welcome everybody that is listening to us wherever you are listening. Uh, and we're going to be in Genesis 37 today. So we're really starting. It says, the first line here says this is the Jacob narratives. This is the story of Jacob. But really this is the story of Jacob's descendant, Joseph, it's a very fascinating thing. We've been tracking throughout Genesis, we've been tracking the seed of promise that will lead to the cross. The descendancy from Abraham, well, really from the woman in the garden down to the cross of Christ. But we have this interesting large section on Joseph. And Joseph is a good man. By and large, he is a righteous man. Though in chapter 37, he's young, and he shows his youth in chapter 37. So let's pick up in verse 1. Joseph dreams of greatness, his own greatness. Verse 1 says, "Now Jacob dwelt in the land where his father was a stranger, in the land of Canaan." This is an important thing. There is a verse in, I believe, in Deuteronomy. My ancestor, our father Abraham, was a wanderer in the land, something like that, a stranger in the land. And some scholars consider that the very oldest portion of the Bible. That saying had been passed down about Abraham, and that was kind of the cornerstone of the beginning of the Bible. I don't know, but this phrase, he was a stranger in the land of Canaan, God gives them the land, but they are at this point still aliens there. Very much I would like to make the connection that is like salvation. Our equivalent, our New Testament equivalent of this phrase would be, we are lost in our sins. We are separated from God. We are strangers to God wherever we are. But when he calls us back to the land, he is calling us into fellowship with him. And so I would connect that here. That is a lostness. We might say a lostness at this point. Now this phrase, rather than being a prologue for the beginning of chapter 37, this probably belongs as an epilogue for the previous chapter, talking about Esau and so forth. And we find this a lot. As we know, the verses and chapters in the Bible are not inspired. A man, Bishop Ussher, about 500 years ago, went through the Bible, divided it into chapter and verse, and thank goodness he did. It's a wonderful thing that he did for finding a specific phrase. I mean, it really helps organize us. Prior to him, there was just a big book, and you had to know where stuff was to find it. Can you imagine? But the point that I make is chapter 37 is not inspired, that number. And verse 1 is not inspired. And so often, I think if you remember back to when we were in Genesis chapter 5, we had a big long genealogy, and it came down to Noah. And then we started out in chapter 6, and those first four verses, you remember we had a big long discussion about there being giants in the land and all that. That probably all of that needed to go back with chapter 5, that it made more sense with chapter 5 rather than a prologue to the flood story that was the back end, the epilogue to the genealogies of chapter 5. And I think the same thing is happening here. But this phrase is picked up in Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews is a very important, we've been through Hebrews together. And to me, Hebrews really helps us as Christians to tie together these Old Testament stories with the New Testament. And the writer of Hebrews picks up this idea of being a stranger in the land of Canaan. Talking in the Hall of Faith in chapter 11 of Hebrew, all these people died still believing what God had promised them. Okay? I don't know if you remember, we had a long discussion about Abraham believing God and it was reckoned to him for righteousness, and that he was forgiven. And I presented the idea that forgiveness for Abraham was conditional and it was temporary. The forgiveness that he received will get him to Judgment Day. This is what I think. I think the same thing is true for us. When we are forgiven for our sins, when we ask Jesus in, we are forgiven temporarily until Judgment Day. And I believe at Judgment Day, we will, however you like to think about it, I don't know exactly, but basically we will stand trial for our life, and we'll realize that we deserve separation from God for eternity. We deserve the lake of fire. And Jesus will intercede and will be evaluated ultimately by the righteousness of Christ. We will be given the righteousness of Christ. So I think that's what this phrase, this complex phrase is. All these people of faith died still believing what God had promised them. They did not receive what was promised, but they saw it from a distance and welcomed it. That is the salvation that comes through Jesus. They agreed that they were foreigners and nomads here on earth. Now, do I believe that Abraham will be in heaven? Yes, I do. Yes, I do. I believe that those people that died forgiven, who put their faith in God, under that system, I believe that Jesus will go back on a case-by-case basis. And so, for example, Abraham was reckoned righteous to get him to Judgment Day, and I believe Jesus will intercede for him, for the righteous, on Judgment Day. That's rather complex thought. That was a heavy theological thought for a minor phrase, but I think it is a significant phrase. I think this stranger in the land of Canaan is where the garden was. That is the place where they walked with God. That is what heaven will be. I think heaven will be on the new earth, and it will be basically the Garden of Eden, and we will walk with God there. Anyway, a big heavy thought to start. In verse 2 it said, this is the history of Jacob. Now there's a map, and you can kind of see most likely, I believe I can't remember if this is a slide I have. Let me just read this first. I can't remember how I did this slide. This is the history of Jacob, but then it goes into talking about Joseph. Joseph being 17-year-old. What do we know about 17-year-old young men? Generally, they are very confident in themselves, confident in what they know and what they think. He was 17-year-old. He was feeding the flock with his brothers. All right, we're getting a lot of information. The 17-year-old sets an expectation of his attitude. He was feeding the flock, so he was a shepherd, and he was with his brothers. Remember, we've been talking about Jacob and the choices that Jacob made and the willfulness of Jacob and all the messes that came as a result of Jacob. And it culminated in Genesis 34 in that awful tragic story at Shechem. But there is still some dysfunction in this family. There's still some resentment. The lad was with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. In Hebrew it says his father's women. It does not use the term. It is interesting to me. Usually handmaids that the father has children with are called concubines, and they have a separate word. Bilhah and Zilpah are never called concubines. They're called wives. But we know that just reading between the lines is a better way to say it. Reading between the lines, they never had full status as wives. We know Rachel was at the top. She was the favored wife. Leah delivered the most children, 7 children that we know of, if you include Dinah. And Zilpah and Bilhah each contributed 2 sons to the family. We know that when Joseph was putting his family out front to meet Esau in case Esau attacked, and put himself at the back of the group, he put Bilhah and Zilpah and their kids out front. And so I believe telling us that it is Bilhah and Zilpah's sons tells us that they're going to be especially resentful of Joseph. Joseph, as we're going to see in a minute, is the favored son of the favored wife and the son of Abraham's old age. He doted on Joseph. And Joseph brought a bad report of Bilhah and Zilpah's sons back to Jacob. Okay? Is that going to win? There's already resentment. Somebody needs to pull Joseph aside and say, Joseph, look, you did not cause this mess, but you have grown up in a mess. Don't be giving bad reports about your brothers. You don't need the grief that will come from that. But nobody did. All right. But way back, if we go all the way back, the last time we heard of where Isaac was, he was at Beer, which means well, Lahai Roy. And that is the well of Lahai is the living. Roy is the God who sees. The living God who sees is what that is. The well of the living God that sees. So very much in the south, we might make the assumption possibly that they live there. It says in the valley of Hebron, and Hebron is just north of here, so it's somewhere down in the southern. They call that the Negev now. Negev, it just means southern in Hebrew. Verse 3 tells us, now Israel loved Joseph more than all his other children because he was the son of his old age. Also, he made him a tunic of many colors. So not only did he love Joseph more, he let it be known that he loved Joseph more. We can't help but have favorites in the world. Everybody has favorites, that's normal. But it is very polite to keep your favorites to yourself when they are part of a group. It is bad form. Have I criticized Jacob enough? I want to get a couple more. We're about done with Jacob. I want to get a kick to his backside here. Don't make it obvious that Joseph is the favorite. It's okay to be favored. All right. So he was the favored son of the favored wife. We go back to chapter 29, verse 30. Then Jacob also went in to Rachel. Now I missed this for whatever reason. I want to claim that I'm an innocent-minded person. But I had missed, for my life thus far, that Jacob was married to Leah, and he went in and he slept with her. And then he made the deal with Laban for Rachel to work another 7 years in order to be married to her. I presume at the end of that time, but he went ahead and slept with Rachel right then. That had slipped my mind prior to this. I hope that I haven't corrupted anybody. Then Jacob went also into Rachel. That's what that means. And he also loved Rachel more than Leah. he served with Laban still another 7 years. And I do think that number 7 is significant. That's all that you should work for a wife. 7 is the number of, we'd say, perfection, which just means complete. It's finished. He worked 7 years for Leah. That was it. She was supposed to be the wife. Trickery was used, but he really loved Rachel, so he went. Now, this special coat, I give you the Hebrew equivalent there, ketonet pasim. That was the Hebrew. In Hebrew, that word pasim is for the palm of your hands or the sole of your feet. And so a ketonet is a tunic that reaches the palms of your hands and the sole of your feet. So a long, formal dress tunic. A tunic is a shirt, that you wear and put a belt at the waist. And so in the Hebrew, it says a long coat, basically, a long sleeve coat, as opposed to just a vest that you might put on. But then when you get to the Old Greek, it said ketona poikilon. I'm better at reading the Hebrew. Ketona poikilon, which means a coat, might mean more of underwear. It is clothes wore close to the skin, and that poikilon is multicolored, many-colored. And so the multicolored coat comes from the Greek version. The Old Hebrew said a long-sleeve coat. It really is immaterial. It's more fun. A coat of many colors is more fun. And when we make the collages and the mobiles for babies and drew cartoons, a coat of many colors is a lot better story. But the idea is this was a special coat. This was a long coat. It stood out to everybody. It was very visibly a preferential treatment for Joseph. Verse 4, but when his brothers saw that his father loved him more than all the brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. Is this a surprise that his brothers dislike him? It is a surprise to nobody. And that's why one reason we teach the story to kids, because they can grab what's going on here. And again, this is a black mark beside Joseph's name, yet another. As if that wasn't enough, as if all the things that Jacob did to cause strife, favoring him obviously and publicly, if that wasn't enough, we go on. There is Joseph talking to his older brothers. He's a boy. They're men. I would imagine Reuben could be 40 or 45 easily. We don't know exactly how the ages were. But there's little Joseph talking. What did he say? Now, Joseph had a dream. And immediately he went and told his brothers, and they hated him even more. So here was the dream, verse 6. So he said to them, please hear this dream which I have dreamed. There we were, binding sheaves in the field, sheaves of wheat, and behold, my sheaf arose and also stood upright, stood up straight. It didn't bend over. Indeed, your sheaves stood all around, and they bowed down to my sheaf. Was that necessary? Don't you want to shake Joseph right there? And we know that Joseph goes on to be a fine man. Truly, fine man. But what are you thinking? This is true. This is sheltered. This is a sheltered kid, I believe. His brothers said to him, shall you indeed reign over us? Or shall you indeed have dominion over us? So they hated him more for his dreams and for his words. Verse 9, then he dreamed still another dream and told it to his brothers and said, look, I have dreamed another dream. This time the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars bow down to me. That's even grander, isn't it? I'm like, I don't like Joseph. So why two dreams? Why do we have two dreams? Well, Joseph will later give an answer to that. In Genesis 42:32, Pharaoh comes to him trouble. Pharaoh has had two dreams about famine, and Joseph interprets the dreams for him. And he says the dream was repeated to Pharaoh twice because the thing is established by God. Two dreams means that it is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. So I think it would be safe to say to call Joseph a prophet. Uh, Joseph is prophesying. We have the whole story, and we know that at the end, his brothers do in fact bow down to him. Uh, and so always we got to remember, you have to hold in balance as you read these stories about the Bible. Ultimately, these stories are meant to tell us about God's nature. The people are making choices and doing their things and interacting, and some are acting good and some are acting bad. And all through that, God is working a purpose. And his purpose ultimately is to save the nation of Israel from hunger, from starving to death, and to forge them in the fires of slavery, might be a way that you say it. God is taking them into slavery in Egypt eventually in order to work his work. It's a big work, and I think it involves us. And I think we might take a metaphor out of the slavery in Egypt, that is the bondage and the slavery we are in before we come back to the land with God. Again, that same thing, we wander and we sojourn in our separation from God, looking for meaning, looking for significance, looking for validation, but we're lost and we're not getting it. And the harder we try, the further it seems that the only true salvation is to return to the land, to return for us to come to the cross. The seed, the descendant, the promised descendant came, lived a perfect life, died on the cross for our sins, and that's the way we return. That God is working, God will bring it to pass. He's working a big plan in all these little stories. So this is me, this headline, Joseph, please give it a rest. Just hush. Don't say anything else. Don't talk to your brothers. Say, yes, sir. Thank you. But does he? Verse 10. So he told it to his father too, and his brothers. And his father rebuked him and said, what is this dream that you have dreamed? Boy, shall your mother and I and your brothers indeed come to bow down to the earth before you? Now let's step away from where we are at in the scripture. You have all read the book. What is the true and literal answer to this question that Jacob asked Joseph? The true answer is, yes, you will. And if you don't believe it, flip over a few pages. It goes on in verse 11. And his brothers envied him. Okay? That is an understatement. That's a different word. It is kana. And it is a hot, angry jealousy. Kana drives you to strike your brother in the head out in the field and kill him. So it's what we see in that term is an escalation. You see that at the end. Their anger is rising. And Jacob is instigating a lot of this. And his brothers envied him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Is that familiar? Or is that shocking to you that Jacob sees a problem developing with his kids, and he does not intervene? Is anybody surprised? No. That's Jacob, isn't it? Jacob is only active when he's making a deal for himself. But when it comes to looking after his kids, he keeps the matter in mind. he doesn't act on it. Yeah, I believe in Hebrew it just says he kept the thing. Kept the thing or kept the word. It's a debar, and that's a word or a thing. So he didn't do anything. So looking at that phrase, bow down, we've already talked about this. Bow down appears in verses 7 and 10. It foreshadows the other end of the Joseph narratives when they come down to Egypt in the famine and are hungry. Everyone will bow down before Joseph in Egypt in Genesis 42:6. So Joseph is prophesying there. Verse 12, then his brothers went to feed their father's flock in Shechem. We're familiar with Shechem. We've been there. I will share with you a theory that I have, and this goes in the category of kind of who cares. We tell stories somewhat differently as modern people, or we like our stories differently. We put an expectation on a story as modern people that they did not necessarily put on as ancient people. And that is we like the first thing that happened to happen first in the story, and the thing that comes next in reality to come next in the story. Don't you agree? We don't like things. Have you ever watched a movie where they twist everything around? They're frustrating to modern people. Well, that is much more the way that ancient people might tell a story. I pretty much believe that this story about Joseph happened before Genesis 34. Okay? What happened in Genesis 34? They killed everybody in Shechem, all the men in Shechem. And then what happened at the end of that ugly story after they'd killed everybody? All the other brothers, Simeon and Levi, went in and killed everybody, butchered everybody. And then the other brothers came and did what? They plundered, they looted, they enslaved women and children. Now, y'all have all read the story. You see Joseph, a little boy Joseph, he's 17 here, so he would have been less than 17 there, going in and looting. Based on the Joseph that you have grown up with, reading about, do you see him looting and taking slaves? I do not. And what I would say is that the Bible has been put together. Again, red flag this as a Rex theory. This should not challenge anybody. As the author was telling the stories, his purpose was to tell us the very lowest point in Jacob's the story, mainly about Jacob, and kind of how Jacob's mistakes in life came all together into a big tragedy. And then this is a story we're talking about Joseph from here on out, and this story happens. But one, it does not make sense that Joseph was in on the plundering, to me. I mean, and I'm just telling you, I'm just giving you an opinion. Two, at the end of the story, how did the people living around Shechem feel about Jacob and his story and his family? What was the last thing Jacob said? You made me a stench in the nostrils of my enemies. They are far more numerous than me. They will hunt us down and kill us. Oh, well, let's go up there and take our sheep up there to graze. That doesn't make sense. Next, we're going to see here in a moment that the brothers are up somewhere around Shechem with their flocks. And who does Jacob send from Hebron, which is in the south, up there to check on them? Joseph, his little boy, and he doesn't care what happens to Joseph, does he? Yes, he does. Is he going to send Joseph up to Shechem to get the other brothers? It doesn't make any sense. My theory, and it does not challenge what I know about storytelling. They're not as concerned as modern people are about the order of things. It just makes sense to me that Joseph was in Egypt when the brothers came and looted in Genesis 34. That story happened after this story. Anyway, take that, put it in your pocket, wad it up, and throw it in the garbage can as you go out, because it really doesn't matter. This is the Bible. that is here. But it does bring up an important point. It's not that the Bible is wrong, because the Bible doesn't tell a story the way people 4,000 years later expect a story to be told. All it means is when the human author was putting together these stories, this is the order that made the best sense to him for his purposes in telling the story. He was teaching us about God and God working in this family and God bringing this family on a journey. He wasn't worried about, oh, this event happened here and then the next date was here and so forth. Anyway, so just chew on that. Now, back to this. Then his brothers went to feed their father's flock at Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, Israel is Jacob's new name that they're using here pretty much from here on. Are not your brothers feeding the flock in Shechem? Come, I will send you to them. So he said to him, so Joseph answered his father, here I am. Or I am in submission to you, Father, I do your will. And so again there you see the map. Hebron is, if you can see, about halfway up, going right over from the Dead Sea. So they lived, it says, in the valley of Hebron, so somewhere between Beer Lahai Roi and Hebron, maybe in Hebron, and they went up to Shechem. I would say you're talking about 50 miles there. So it's a pretty good little journey, several days' walk. Then he said to Joseph, please go and see if it is well with your brothers and well with the flocks, and bring back word to me. So he sent him out of the valley of Hebron, and he went to Shechem. Now a certain man found him. He got lost as he got up to Shechem. Again, we're told about a man who actually gives him helpful information here. Not, do what? You're from the family of Jacob? We've been waiting for you, boy. A certain man found him, and there he was, wandering in the field. And the man asked him, saying, what are you seeking? So he said, I am seeking my brothers. Please tell me where they are, feeding their flocks. The man said, they have departed from here, for I heard them say, let us go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them in Dothan. And so there you see another map, Hebron down in the south, Shechem up the Jordan, and then Dothan a little ways north there. And of course he gets nabbed in Dothan and makes the journey all the way down to Egypt. There's what Dothan looks like. And so it says in verse 18, and you can believe it with this landscape, now when they saw him afar off, the brothers, they saw him, he was still a long way. They had time to scheme before he got there. Even before he came near them, they conspired against him to kill him. Their rage had escalated to where they wanted open violence. Again, let me ask you a question about Israel Jacob. Does Israel Jacob have his thumb on the pulse of his family? At the very least, he is an aloof daddy. At the very nicest thing you can say about him is that he is an aloof father. Verse 19, then they said to one another, look, the dreamer is coming. Come therefore, let us now kill him and cast him into the pit. And we will say, some wild beast has devoured him. We shall see what will become of his dreams. Again, there's foreshadowing there, isn't it? Will these brothers see what comes of his dreams? Yes. Life and sin has a way of humbling us. But Reuben heard it and delivered him out of their hands and said, let us not kill him. So Reuben has some leadership. Now it's interesting here how the story, Reuben intervenes as the oldest. And then we're going to see in a minute, Judah also intervenes. And Reuben said to them, shed no blood, but cast him into a pit or a cistern, which is in the wilderness, and do not lay a hand on him, that he might deliver him out of their hands. This was Reuben's plan. He was going to rescue Joseph and bring him back to his father. I believe we've already been told that Reuben had slept with Bilhah, and Reuben will not get the rights of the firstborn because of that. He'll be disqualified. And so it seems that Reuben is trying to make it up to his father at this point. Verse 23, so it came to pass when Joseph had come to his brothers, and they stripped Joseph of his tunic and the tunic of many colors that was on him. Then they took him and cast him into a pit, and the pit was empty. There was no water in it. And they sat down to eat a meal. Then they lifted their eyes and looked. There was a company of Ishmaelites, Arabians, descendants of Ishmael. Ishmael would be their great uncle, right? Isaac's their granddaddy. Ishmaelites, these are descendants. So these are distant cousins, coming from Gilead with their camels, bearing spices, balm, myrrh, on their way, carrying them down to Egypt. So Judah is mentioned because he plays a special role in Genesis. So Judah said to his brothers, what profit is there if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? It seems that Judah is now scheming, like his father Jacob might scheme. But he is working to rescue Joseph also. So Judah's plan is to save Joseph, but there's a little problem with it. When you look over in Deuteronomy, it says he suggests, why don't we sell Joseph to the Ishmaelites if a man is found kidnapping any of his brethren of the children of Israel? So any Israelite, especially if it is your half-brother, and mistreats him or sells him, then the kidnapper shall die. And you shall put away the evil from among you. So is it okay what Judah suggests here? So the Bible writer needs to do something quick, doesn't he? In my opinion, because Judah's a pretty important character, because he's the seed is going through there. So if I'm right, we gotta redeem Judah's character here, don't we? Because he just broke what will become a law in the future. Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh. And his brothers listened. So that was Judah's plan for rescuing him, but we got a problem with it in the law of Moses coming in the future. Now watch this. In the New King James Bible, and this is what translators do sometimes, is they add a word or two to help us understand, because sometimes the Hebrew is very confusing. This verse in Hebrew is ambiguous. That means we don't know exactly who the pronouns are talking about. So the New King James helped us. They added brother. The Midianites, then Midianite traders passed by. All right? This is different than the Ishmaelites. Midianites and Ishmaelites are different. So the brothers, that is not what the Hebrew says. That is added by the English translators. Pulled Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites. Why did they mention the Midianites? For 20 shekels of silver they took Joseph to Egypt. And if what the New King James interpreters are saying is true, then Judah has violated the laws of Moses and deserves death. But if you take out the brothers, which is not in the Hebrew, then what does it say? Then Midianite traders passed by and pulled Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver, and they took Joseph to Egypt. Okay? I make a case to you that the New King James translators did us a disservice trying to clarify a rough verse, an unclear verse, and they changed the meaning of the verse. I believe Midianite, what the Hebrew said, is correct. And the author wanted us to know Judah suggested the plan in order to rescue his brother, and then Midianite traders came by and took Joseph out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites, who took him into slavery in Egypt. And Judah is off the hook. That's what I think the Bible says. Does anybody want to wrestle with me over that? All right. Let's move on then. Then Reuben, who is out of the loop, returned to the pit. So they left him there in the pit. The Midianites took him out, sold him to the Ishmaelites. He went to Egypt. Reuben came back, and indeed Joseph was not in the pit. He tore his clothes, and he returned to his brothers and said, "The lad is no more. And I, where shall I go?" This was my plan to get back in good with Dad, and now it's gone. So they took Joseph, so they acted on their original plan, which was to kill him and make it look like an animal did it, even though he was gone and they don't know where he went. So they took Joseph's tunic, killed a kid of goats, and dipped the tunic in the blood. Then they sent the tunic of many colors, and they brought it to their father and said, "We have found this. Do you know whether it's your sons or not?" So to clean them, that's Joseph. They're grieving. He recognized it. Jacob grieving. Israel recognized it and said, "It is my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him." Without doubt, Joseph is torn to pieces. Then Jacob tore his clothes, put sackcloth on his waist, and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and all his daughters arose to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. He said, "For I shall go down into the grave to my son in mourning." I think that's a bad translation. I'm all over the New King James today. Thus his fathers wept. Here's what it says literally in Hebrew, that last phrase. Okay, so, "For I shall go down to the grave in my son in mourning." What it says in Hebrew literally is, "For I shall go down to my son in mourning of death," in mourning of his death. I believe this is meant to foreshadow the outcome of the story. I shall go down to Egypt to my son after mourning for years for his death. And so they just switched that word grave. The word death there is Sheol. We know that is the holding tank. And so sometimes it is grave. Sometimes it is death. Sometimes some versions, English versions, just write Sheol. But I believe "I shall go down to my son in mourning for his death" is a much better translation of that verse. And then that foreshadows the end of the story. Eventually, Jacob will go down to Egypt to his son, whom he thought was dead all these years, whom he mourned for many years. Foreshadowing later events. In the last verse of the chapter, now the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and captain of the guard. Now, something recently I was discussing with somebody, a lot of Egyptologists do not believe that Potiphar is an Egyptian name. And so they said, thus, this is a made-up story. That's what Egyptologists and scientists do with things. Science is a study of repeating patterns. And so stuff has to happen over and over in order for science to be able to recognize it. It's a study of patterns. And so to me, the fact that they can't find Potiphar tells us that it was a unique name, which to me makes it more likely to be true than for it to be a made-up story. Do you see my logic there? They would pick a very good, if somebody wanted to make up a story about a happening, they would pick a much better Egyptian name. Anyway, we'll talk more about Potiphar. We are set up now. We're going to find, not next time. Next time we have a very interesting, a little bit naughty, a little bit scandalous story in Genesis 38. There is a possibility you might not have known that this story was in there because we don't teach this much in Sunday school, what's going to happen in Genesis 38. Then in Genesis 39, we come back to this point and we find Joseph in Egypt. Isn't this good stuff? Good stuff. I find it fascinating. But again, we are seeing the fruits of Jacob, of God saying, Jacob, this is what I want for you. And Jacob saying, no, I have something else that I want. When we match our will against God's will, the Bible author would say this is the kind of madness that results from us fighting and wrestling with God. So still more. Any questions or comments as we close? John?
If you go 2 slides back.
I can't go backwards when I'm recording.
Where it talks about Jacob recognized his coat of many colors and he wept and said his sons and daughters comforted him. I thought he just had one daughter, Dinah.
We don't always name, as ancient Hebrew writers, we don't always name the females. You just assume there's lots of daughters. Why was Dinah named? Because Dinah is a big deal in Genesis 34. That's the only reason we know her name. There's lots of daughters. Likely they had more daughters than sons. They just kept trying until they got the sons.
I think it's strange that Jacob mourned for Joseph for 20 years and he wasn't even dead.
It is.
That's strange.
Well, I think there's a metaphor there. I think there is a symbolism there. That Jacob always had an idea of how he wanted God to bless him. And the idea that Joseph was gone was God taking from him what he wanted. What he needed to see was for God to be his portion. But he mourned, and it is an irony. That's one of the richness of the way that the Hebrews tell these stories. They love that irony that Jacob is mourning for something that has not actually happened. And so it's true. I think we cling to things and idealize things a lot in life. And the Bible author would say we're turning things the wrong direction, looking at things wrongly in that. But the book of Genesis is just, it's so much fun. It's so much fun to work through. It's complex though. Anything, John?
I had a pastor, I think I've told you this before. I had a pastor about 20 years ago who said that Jacob's faith was right on track, that he was called Israel.
Mm-hmm.
But when his faith wavered, he was called Jacob. And if you look overall in the book, that's true.
Yeah. Okay. That could be. Could be. I'll have to look at that. Anything else? All right. Well, let's close right there and say a little prayer and come back next week.